The story begins not with the sound of clashing swords or the roar of war drums, but with silence, the kind of silence that only ancient battlefields know. Once, these plains had echoed with victory cries led by a man whose name inspired both awe and fear. Yet today, his name is gone, erased from monuments, omitted from chronicles, buried beneath centuries of dust. The narrator's voice cuts through the stillness. How can a man who never lost a single battle vanish from history itself? This question sets the tone, a mystery that bridges the gap between triumph and oblivion, between the immortality of victory and the fragility of memory. The story is not only about war, it is about the politics of remembrance, the power of envy, and the cruel truth that history is written not by the undefeated, but by the survivors. To understand this forgotten legend, we must first travel back in time, to an age when the fate of empires was decided by the march of armies and the will of their generals. It was a world of fragile alliances, brutal ambition, and shifting frontiers. Kingdoms rose and fell in the span of a lifetime, and glory was often as fleeting as breath. In this world, generals were more than soldiers. They were symbols of divine favor and national destiny. Yet, behind the banners and the armor, the truth was far more human. Every victory had a cost, and every general's triumph was shadowed by political intrigue waiting to claim its due. This was the arena into which our forgotten commander was born, an era that demanded both genius and ruthlessness to survive. From the first campaigns of his youth, he displayed a mind unlike any of his contemporaries. While others relied on brute force and predictable formations, he saw the battlefield as a living puzzle. He studied terrain as if it were scripture, anticipating the enemy's movements with eerie precision. His armies were smaller, often outnumbered, yet somehow always in the right place at the right time. He transformed what should have been disasters into breathtaking victories. Villages whispered his name long before the courts did, and soldiers followed him with a devotion that bordered on reverence. To them, he was more than a commander. He was a shield, a strategist who made them believe that even against impossible odds, victory was not only possible but inevitable. But this was also a time when greatness could be dangerous. For every victory that brought him glory, it also stirred unease among those who ruled. Kings and emperors do not tolerate men who become too beloved, too successful, or too independent. Behind palace walls, where daggers were sharper than swords, whispers began to spread. Could any man truly remain undefeated without divine protection? Was he still loyal to the crown, or did his fame make him a rival in all but name? What began as admiration turned slowly into suspicion. Even as the general's victories expanded the borders of his empire, his influence began to contract in the eyes of those he served. And yet, history did not record these doubts. The chroniclers, sponsored by courts and temples, wrote what their patrons wished to endure. Official records spoke of campaigns and treaties, not of jealousy or fear. The general's name, once etched beside victories that reshaped the world, began to fade from inscriptions. Generations later, his existence would be reduced to fragments, an unnamed tactician here, a reference in an enemy's account there. Still, beneath these fragments lies a story too compelling to remain forgotten. The story of a man who mastered the art of war so completely that he became a threat not to his enemies, but to his own masters. This opening act is not simply a chronicle of battles. It is an invitation to rediscover a life nearly lost to time. We will journey through the world he knew, the dust of the roads his armies marched, the smell of iron and sweat, the echoes of speeches that rallied men before dawn assaults. We will uncover not just how he fought, but why he fought, and how his loyalty became both his greatest strength and his doom. His victories will be examined not as myths, but as precise moments of brilliance that defied the limits of human strategy. Each one will bring us closer to understanding the paradox that defines him, the man who never lost, yet ultimately disappeared from history. And as we step into his world, one question will linger over every scene. If history can erase even the undefeated, what hope is there for anyone to be remembered at all? He was not born into power, nor was he destined for greatness. His name, once spoken with reverence by soldiers and kings alike, belonged to a man who began life in obscurity, far from the glittering capitals where history was written. The world he entered was fractured and perilous, carved into rival realms locked in endless conflict. Armies marched not for ideals, but for gold, borders, and pride. In this chaos, young men were forged in hardship, and only the most cunning survived. Our general, then just a nameless recruit, entered this brutal landscape with nothing but his intellect and an unyielding will to prove himself. He watched, learned, and waited, absorbing every lesson the battlefield could offer. Where others saw chaos, he saw patterns. Where commanders relied on tradition, he found opportunity in unpredictability. Even before he held command, his mind was already charting the shape of victory. His rise began not through noble lineage or royal favor, but through competence too undeniable to ignore. During one of the early border wars, his unit was ambushed by a force 3 times its size. The officers panicked, the line began to crumble, but he seized command. With nothing more than instinct and nerve, he ordered a sudden retreat toward high ground, luring the enemy into a choke point between 2 ridges. Then, with a signal of torches, he launched a counterattack at dusk, catching the overconfident pursuers trapped and disoriented. When the sun rose, the field was littered with enemy dead, and the rumor of an unknown soldier's brilliance began to spread. Commanders took notice, promotions followed. Soon he was entrusted with his own company, then a legion, and with each campaign, his legend grew sharper, more undeniable. But his genius was not born merely from luck or timing. It was rooted in a philosophy of war that defied convention. To him, warfare was not about strength, it was about understanding. He studied terrain like an artist studying light. He believed every hill, river, and storm could become an ally if used correctly. Before every campaign, he would walk the land himself, sketching maps by hand, calculating angles of approach, predicting the rhythm of weather and morale. His soldiers said he could see the battle before it began, and that sense of foresight made his men follow him without question. He turned disciplined formations into living instruments, moving them with such precision that his enemies often believed he had divine insight. With each victory, his reputation grew, not only for tactical brilliance but for the bond he forged with his soldiers. He ate what they ate, slept on the same cold ground, and refused privileges that separated commander from man. He learned their names, listened to their fears, and shared their hunger. In return, they would march through hell for him. When he ordered impossible maneuvers, they did not hesitate, they trusted that he saw what they could not. One chronicler wrote that, "His men fought not for coin, nor country, but for the faith that no one under his banner would die in vain." It was this devotion that made his army more than an instrument. It became an extension of his will. As his fame grew, so too did the complexity of his campaigns. He was sent to defend remote provinces, to quell rebellions, to face enemies who outnumbered him 10 to 1. Each time, he adapted his methods like water taking the shape of a vessel. In one campaign, he feigned retreat for 7 days, leading a larger force deep into hostile terrain before encircling and destroying it in a single night. In another, he used fires on distant hills to simulate multiple armies, tricking his enemies into splitting their strength before striking the weakest point. He never repeated the same trick twice. Every battle was a lesson, every victory a masterpiece of adaptation. The pattern became clear. He could not be beaten, because he never fought the same war twice. But with victory came visibility, and with visibility came envy. At court, whispers began to circulate, whispers of arrogance, of ambition, of a general who grew too powerful for comfort. His rise, once celebrated, began to make others uneasy. Ministers feared his influence. Other generals resented his perfection. His loyalty was questioned in private chambers, his motives dissected by men who had never set foot on a battlefield. And yet, out in the field, his soldiers continued to win under his command. The throne might have doubted him, but the front lines knew the truth. He was the reason their empire endured. Still, the storm was coming. For now, this section of his life shone like the calm before the tempest. His banners fluttered across conquered plains, his strategies were studied and imitated, and his name became a symbol of invincibility. But the higher he rose, the lonelier the air became. He was a man devoted to victory, yet increasingly alienated from those he served. The people hailed him as a hero, the court watched him as a threat, and history began to turn its gaze, not to celebrate, but to judge. This was the height of his ascent, the moment where triumph and tragedy stood side by side, unaware of which would strike first. Every battle won added another laurel to his name, but also another shadow behind it. For in a world ruled by kings and intrigue, even the undefeated could not escape the one war that strategy could not master, the war for power itself. The march into Bactria tested Alexander's army as no campaign before it. The land was a labyrinth of mountains, deserts, and rebel fortresses, hostile, endless, and merciless. The Bactrian nobility, led by the cunning Spitamines, refused open battle, preferring ambushes and night raids. Supply lines stretched thin, and each step forward felt like a descent into chaos. For the first time, the invincible army felt mortal. Blizzards swept down from the Hindu Kush, freezing men and beasts alike. Horses starved, weapons rusted, and morale cracked beneath the weight of exhaustion. Yet Alexander's will did not waver. He marched at the front, refusing rest, sharing his soldiers' hunger and cold. His resolve became their only fire. Realizing brute force would fail, Alexander turned to strategy. He divided his forces, sending swift detachments to hunt the elusive enemy. Villages that resisted were burned, strongholds stormed, and survivors relocated, harsh measures that broke rebellion but hardened hatred. The campaign became less about victory and more about endurance, a contest of wills between king and land. When Spitamine struck again, slaughtering a Macedonian garrison, Alexander's fury ignited. He unleashed relentless pursuit through deserts and rivers, his cavalry moving like thunder. But Spitamines always vanished into the steppe, aided by the terrain and by Alexander's former allies, who now doubted the cost of conquest. This was not the glorious warfare of Greece. It was survival in a world that defied reason. Each village taken brought no triumph, only silence. Each victory left Alexander colder, harder. Yet through the endless struggle, a legend was forming. A king who refused to break, who fought not just enemies, but nature itself. The Bactrian campaign was no longer a march of conquest, it was a battle for Alexander's soul. His return from the frontier was not met with triumph, but with silence. The emperor who once praised him now regarded him with suspicion. Whispers filled the court, claims that his soldiers followed him, not the crown, that his victories were no longer for empire but for himself. Advisors stoked the fire, producing forged letters and twisting rumors until admiration turned to fear. The general who had secured the empire's borders was now seen as a threat to its throne. Summoned to the capital, he entered the palace as a loyal servant and left as a condemned man. The emperor's judgment was cruel and calculated. Death would make him a martyr, so his name was to be erased instead. His statues were torn down, inscriptions defaced, victories reassigned to others. The man who had never lost a battle was defeated without a single sword drawn. His soldiers were scattered, his records rewritten, his memory deliberately buried. Yet even as his erasure began, the general remained calm. Before disappearing from the court, he said only, "I have faced every enemy without fear. I will face this one the same." Some say he died in exile, others whisper he lived under another name, wandering the lands he once conquered. Whatever his fate, his legend could not be contained. Enemies recorded his brilliance, foreign scholars praised his methods, and in the silence of suppression his shadow grew larger. The empire believed it had destroyed him, but it had only created a myth. The undefeated general had vanished from history's pages, yet not from its memory, and in that quiet victory he won his final invisible war. Years passed, and the empire's chronicles continued their lie. His name was gone, but traces of his genius refused to die. In remote provinces, old soldiers whispered of a commander who led them through storms and slaughter, calling him only the ghost. Among enemies, his tactics were studied with reverence. Even those who once feared him could not deny his mastery. The empire had erased a name, not a legacy. Centuries later, fragments began to surface, broken statues, defaced mosaics, and scrolls describing an unnamed general who never knew defeat. Archaeologists uncovered battle accounts matching his style, ambushes timed with weather, marches through impossible terrain, armies that moved like wind. Each discovery restored a piece of what had been stolen. Slowly, scholars realized that behind the empire's faceless victories stood a single man, a strategist so brilliant that rulers had feared his memory. The rediscovery of his story became a revelation. Historians debated his identity, generals admired his philosophy, and artists painted his likeness from fragments. What began as whispers turned into acknowledgement. The empire that silenced him had long since fallen, but the truth it buried was returning to light. His story became more than history. It became a warning. Power can erase names, but not greatness. His perfection had threatened kings, yet it was that same perfection that ensured his immortality. The general who never lost had defeated his final adversary, the centuries themselves. His memory, once condemned, now stood as a symbol of resilience against the deceit of power. Forgotten by kings, remembered by time, the man erased from history had, at last, conquered it. Bactria was finally subdued, but Alexander's victory was hollow. The rebels were dead, yet peace never came. Fortresses rose across the land like scars, monuments to conquest rather than unity. His men, weary and haunted, no longer cheered their king. In the aftermath, Alexander built new cities, symbols of empire and control. He spoke of blending east and west, of divine purpose, yet his heart was consumed by unrest. He drank more, trusted less, and dreamed of ghosts. The campaign had shown him the limits of conquest, but he refused to see them. Instead, he turned eastward again, to India, chasing a vision of glory that could never be fulfilled. The Bactrian campaign had tested not only his army but his soul. It revealed that greatness demanded sacrifice beyond blood. It demanded one's humanity. Alexander had triumphed over mountains, deserts, and kings, but he could not master the darkness within himself. In later years, storytellers would call this campaign his most grueling, his most human. The impossible climbs, the endless marches, the murder of Clitus, all became part of a legend that blurred the line between God and man. As he stood on the edge of the mountains, gazing east into the unknown, Alexander whispered, "Nothing is beyond me." Yet history would remember that in conquering the world, he had begun to lose himself. His greatest victory had become his darkest secret, a reminder that even gods of war are bound by the limits of their own humanity.